Good evening, everyone. There is an ancient Gnostic understanding that was re-articulated by the famous Rabbi Isaac Luria, who lived in the 16th century. His cosmo-mythological formulation was that every individual's soul was in the beginning a part of Adam Kadmon's soul, the primordial man, the anthropos. Adam was created by God as a means to mend the breaking of the vessels of creation. But after his fall, the multitude of soul sparks, also called Scintillae, were torn asunder and scattered in the upper and lower realms of creation, into the world of the broken vessels, while some remained embedded deeper within Adam. Luria believed that each of these scattering fragments was a great soul, each one containing thousands of independent sparks or souls. It is possible to redeem these soul sparks, but this requires a tremendous amount of individual effort to consolidate the holy blessing of God in this project, transformation and ascension. Apparently, our familial or ethnic relations bear very little import with respect to this project of gathering or raising the sparks. Our parents are not composed of the same sparks of which we are composed. We do not share the same root. What is unnerving and beautiful about this conception is that God wills it that we encounter, throughout the unfolding of our lives, every corresponding scintilla that shares the same root as our own. Perhaps we may even have multiple sparks within us. This means that all people, or thoughts, or images, or experiences we encounter share in this spark, because they all commonly share in us, and act upon us or through us by our own very souls. This is regardless of whether these things are evil or good, pleasant or unpleasant. It is a totalizing work that seeks to gather contraries or opposites, irrespective of our own personal moral inclinations. It is beyond good and evil. In Neoplatonic Theurgy, the ascent to the One was possible by transmuting these scintilla animae from the darkest depths of the human soul, in order to liberate them. In Valentinian Gnosis, which arose with Valentinus from 100 to 160 AD, we find a similar articulation of the scintilla sparks, but expressed in the symbol of the seed. This is a very appropriate symbological analogy, because the seed is embedded in matter, or physis, that dark, feminine womb that encompasses and encases the hidden sparks that must be sought out and liberated. In the Kabbalistic and Neoplatonist perspective, it is the evil of the dark unconscious that must be transmuted and elevated to a position where it is sweetened and brought into acceptability and reintegrated. The alchemist Dorn also acknowledges that, quote, "There is nothing in nature that does not contain as much evil as good, and therefore the scintillae are to be met with cautiously, because they are the pharmakon, that is both the poison and the cure. There is a dangerous potency to these sparks, but the categorization of evil and sinister intent by the unconscious, it should be kept in mind, is a bias and prejudice of the conscious attitude, which, as its numinous alchemical symbol the sun, takes a guarded and jealous position against any encroachment from the feminine moon or the unconscious. The conscious attitude will always protect itself by diminishing the powers of anything outside its stranglehold. Once again, as Jung repeatedly stated, the unconscious acts as a compensatory mechanism for the one-sidedness of conscious life. Make no mistake, in order to transmute the philosopher's stone, fire, and therefore heat, from the unconscious is necessary, and fire is a divine but destructive tool. Clement expresses the Valentinian Gnostic system in this section. Jesus, our light, as the apostle says, quote, emptied himself. That is, he went outside the limit, according to Theodotus, and, being an angel from the pleroma, brought together with him the angels of the superior seed. As for himself, he possessed the redemption, since he came forth from the pleroma. The angels, however, he brought in order to set the right seed. To quickly note, this possession of the redemption of Jesus is believed to be a massaging of the original Theodotian Valentinian Gnostic understanding. As Professor Einar Thomason says in his work entitled The Spiritual Seed, the Church of the Valentinians, the original Gnostic theory is that Jesus himself was in need of redemption, having emptied himself of his pleromatic nature and entered the realm of deficiency. In his magnum opus, Mysterium Conuinctionis, Jung speaks of the alchemical allusions to the eye of God, which, quote, emits power and light, and the illustrations in many texts, for example the tree with fishes, the tree of the sages, which is represented in an Arabic alchemical manuscript of the 14th century from Abu al-Qasim al-Iraqi's Kitab al-Aqalim, as-Saba'ah, or the fish's eyes that represent the tiny soul sparks from which the ultimate goal of the lapis philosophorum is composed through their integration. Jung mentions that the reconstitution of these particles of lights are the chief aims of Gnosticism, Manichaeism, and Jainism. In order to bridge the chasm between alchemy and psychology, Jung explains, quote, psychologically, this doctrine testifies to the personality or ego character of psychic complexes. Just as the distinguishing mark of the ego complex is consciousness, so it is possible that other unconscious complexes may possess, as splinter psyches, a certain luminosity of their own. What does this mean? Essentially, that man, contrary to his personal opinion, is not master of his soul. He is fragmented into a multiplicity of entities, each operating autonomously as the psychic gradient works its way across his psyche. Jung quotes the Christian theologian and heresiologist Hippolytus, who wrote in his Elenkos about the many historical heresies that the Church encountered. Many people suspect that his learned research and exposition of the various Gnostic systems suggest that he was sympathetic to their writings and beliefs, or at least had at one time participated in them intimately. The quote is as follows, "And that from the concourse of the atoms both God and all the elements came into being, and that in them were all animals and other things." Here it is important to see atom here not as a contemporary materialist notion, but as precisely these sparks or scintillae. That is what God requires in order to be redeemed, that the Gnostic and the alchemist must redeem the hidden sparks of God, recollect his pieces and fragments, and work to unify him in an act of love and compassion and true gnosis. Dorn, in his Philosophia Meditativa, is quoted in length. "What madness deludes you? For in you, and not proceeding from you, he wills all this to be found, which you seek outside you and not within yourselves. Such is the vice of the common man, to despise everything his own, and always to lust after the strange. The light of men shineth in us, albeit dimly, and as though in darkness. It is not to be sought as proceeding from us, though it is in us, and not of us, but of him to whom it belongeth, who that hath deigned to make us his dwelling place. He hath implanted that light in us, that we may see in its light the light of him who dwelleth in light inaccessible, and that we may excel his other creatures. In this especially we are made like unto him, that he hath given us a spark of his light. Thus the truth is to be sought not in ourselves, but in the image of God which is within us." Jung makes a subtle but important clarification. Dorn is speaking of the image of God, the God image, the imago Dei, which is the reflection of God, as if in a mirror. This God image is an archetype. Unfortunately, this is very often confused with God as such, of which Jung knows nothing can be said. Hence, his religious and traditionalist detractors are very much mistaken when they assume that Jung is trying to, quote, psychologize God, or reduce God into a reductive, nothing but psychological statement. As these seeds or sparks reside in a state of potentiality in the dark prima materia of the unconscious, it is important to slightly modify our understanding of potentiality, or for that matter, the dark abyss of chaos and non-differentiation. For that, let us refer to Hesiod's 8th century BC work of mythical cosmology entitled Theogony, which means birth of the gods. Before any of the gods enter the picture, we begin with primordial chaos, this prima materia, this extension of the unconscious, which participates in the psychic life of all beings. Chaos is parentless, and therefore is not created. But it is crucial to realize that chaos is a featureless being, and not to be confused as an empty space. It is not a 0 point, nor is it a nothingness. It is a something that can be located in the depths of Tartarus, and chaos is never replaced by manifesting things by being filled, but can only be displaced. Chaos is ever present, and bounded by the things and creatures that have emerged since the unfolding of the cosmos. In order for something to manifest, it is important to realize that limit has to be applied to the unlimited. There can be no alternative unless boundaries and restrictions are set. When we use the expression about things, quote, coming into being, we are being confused and misled. As Parmenides outlined in his proem where he encountered the goddess of the underworld, she dismisses the first road of non-being, which is unthinkable and unnameable and cannot be followed. Quote, since it is that generation has been extinguished, and of destruction there is not a word to be heard. But being itself is full, and encloses us all in a loop or a circle. Since there is no more being or less being, something either is or is not. And is not does not mean non-being, for it still participates in being. This forces us to question what we mean by being. Here is the crux. Thoughts and ideas and emotions are alive. They all participate in being, whether invisible or in a state of virtuality. When something is in potential or in a state of virtuality, this does not mean it does not exist. Henry Corbin follows the traces of the Sheikh Muhammad Karim Khan Kirmani in a treatise written in Arabic in 1851 called The Book of the Red Hyacinth, where he illustrates what I've been referring to beautifully with regard to color theory. Kirmani believed that all the philosophers failed to grasp the understanding of color because they failed to make a critical distinction, and that is between existence and manifestation. Kirmani was applying the principle to color theory based on the Quranic verse 15:21, "There are no things whose treasures do not exist alongside us. We make them descend only in determined proportions." For something to, quote, exist, and therefore participate in being, does not mean it has to be visible. This has enormous implications for our understanding of angelosophy and the Ismailian Gnostic exegesis with regard to the Zahir, the exoteric, and the Batin, the inner, hidden, esoteric dimensions. This is again an illustration of a veiling and unveiling. Henry Corbin praised the 20th century philosopher Etienne Souriau for legitimizing this notion of multiple states of being in his philosophical work Les Différents Modes des Existences, and making it acceptable in secular philosophical discourse. The last chapter of this book deals with the artist and his or her relationship with the work of art that moves from conception in a state of virtuality in the ideas, or its angelic celestial counterpart, into something that manifests in a corporeal plane or an embodied plane. There is a gradient whereby the artist, acting as a midwife, is bringing to birth the angel of the work, and like a sculptor, working with raw material, chiseling and chipping away piece by piece and fashioning the work, paradoxically, in the image which originated it. That's why Nietzsche and many others before him believed that the soul of the work resides buried in the chaos or undifferentiated physis of the material or stone, and is finally liberated after the emergence of the statue in its state of completion. This brings us back to the notion of the Scintillae that are also embedded in the dark physis of matter in the unconscious, waiting to be transmuted and worked with in order to bring about its actualization and ultimate closing of the circle of being back to its source in God. Earlier than Etienne Suriot, Jung similarly came to understand the relationship between the work of art and the artist as one of parasitism. The art acts like a parasite on the artist and uses the artist, similarly also the muse, who needs the attentions of the artists, and oftentimes at the cost of a healthy family life or financial stability for the artists themselves, in order to bring itself into manifestation through the vessel of the artist. After all, as we discussed in a previous video, man does not create, he procreates. Creation is the act and domain and dominion of God and the gods. Hesiod's Theogony teaches us exactly that distinction between man and the gods. The Iliad also teaches us that menace or wrath, rage, anger, whether possessing a hero or a god, is not just simply an emotional state, but, quote, a sanction meant to guarantee and maintain the integrity of the world order. And Zeus will use his menace to enforce the maintenance of his cosmic order by enforcing limits on mortals from ever becoming gods. In the Theogony, man is shown that he is of a different classification than the gods in Olympus. This digression was to show that man, once again, does not nor can he create. Things become created and brought into our state of being through man. And that responsibility is immense. When Jung and Solzhenitsyn and others lay the blame at their own feet and at the foot of the individual when society and civilization goes astray, it may come across as very unfair. After all, what did I do to deserve the ignominy of culpability and the blood stain on my hands? I didn't participate. But in this light, the frightening realization comes into play that all of our psychological complexes and neuroses are works in progress, angels in a state of incompletion, perhaps aborted partway or never begun, but the germ of the angel, the celestial counterpart to the human soul, the divine double, has already permeated the conscious individual, or has been there from the beginning, and yearns to be slowly and arduously brought into completion and manifestation. Whether the angel manifests from the archetypal realm as a painting, a poem, a sculpture, or a dance, or whether the art is in fact the most royal of arts, the royal work, the alchemical opus, the process of individuation, of individuating, our responsibility seems to be as a conduit that brings things from the celestial realm to the corporeal realm through that intermediary of the imaginal realm. If you fail to do this, these scintillae, or sparks of light, will continue to remain occluded and veiled, and, in line with their autonomous nature, will grow and shapeshift and grow more limbs and excrescences and outgrowths and become heavier and weigh you down. In short, just as a Neoplatonist like Michael Sellis observed, demons tear you apart in order to maintain that equilibrium, so that we do not overcompensate one attitude over another, or overextend our reach and aim to reach for the sun with waxen wings like Icarus. They seek compensatory redress and balance. In summary, those angels, ones we've promised to bring into the light of day, are transmogrified into those demonic entities that tear us apart and punish us for our failure to carry out our tasks in this lifetime. This is also why the process of individuation is so difficult. Just like the quest for the Holy Grail, it is fraught with dangers and pitfalls in every corner, in the dark wandering night of the soul. Jung was clear. This anamnesis, this recalling or remembering, is a collecting of parts of ourselves, the parts we find acceptable by our ego, and the parts that we deem unacceptable also, the fragments and limbs, torn asunder like Dionysus by the Titans in the Orphic myths. This reconstituting through the scintillae that represent all aspects of our psyche is a movement toward totality and a union of the opposites as we approach the divine self. For many are called, but few are chosen. Take care for now.